They thought I was just another quiet substitute teacher who wouldn't last a week. What they didn't know was that I'd spent 8 years commanding sailors twice their size in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. When they decided to mess with my desk, they had no idea they were about to face someone who'd been trained to handle situations far more dangerous than a group of teenage bullies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Martinez, and I never thought I'd find myself standing in front of a classroom full of teenagers at Jefferson High School in Cedar Falls, Iowa. 6 months ago, I was Lieutenant Commander Martinez, overseeing navigation operations on the USS Constellation somewhere in the South China Sea. Now, I was Ms. Martinez, the new transfer teacher trying to figure out how to operate an ancient projector that looked like it had survived both world wars. The transition from military life to civilian teaching wasn't something I'd planned. After 8 years in the Navy, I'd been looking forward to a long career in maritime operations. But sometimes life throws you curveballs that no amount of military training can prepare you for. My younger brother Jake had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition that required specialized treatment only available at the University of Iowa Medical Center. As his only family since our parents passed away in a car accident 3 years ago, I'd made the difficult decision to leave active duty and move back to Iowa to be closer to him. Cedar Falls was a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and Jefferson High School was the kind of place where the same families had been sending their kids for generations. The building itself was a relic from the 1960s, with long corridors lined with faded green lockers and fluorescent lights that flickered ominously overhead. The smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with teenage anxiety created an atmosphere that was both familiar and completely foreign to someone used to the crisp efficiency of a naval vessel. I'd been hired as a long-term substitute for Mrs. Henderson, who'd taken early retirement after what the principal diplomatically called classroom management issues. The way Principal Davidson had described it during my interview, Mrs. Henderson had simply lost control of her classes and decided teaching wasn't for her anymore. What he hadn't mentioned, and what I'd discover soon enough, was that Jefferson High had a serious problem with student discipline that went far beyond typical teenage misbehavior. My first day started early, as was my habit from years of military service. I arrived at the school at 6 in the morning, 2 hours before classes began, wanting to familiarize myself with the classroom and prepare for what I hoped would be a smooth transition. The building was eerily quiet, with only the night custodian, an older gentleman named Frank, making his rounds. He'd given me a sympathetic look when I'd introduced myself as the new teacher taking over Mrs. Henderson's classes. "Good luck with that bunch," he'd said, shaking his head as he pushed his cart down the hallway. That woman lasted exactly 3 weeks before she threw in the towel. Some of these kids nowadays, they got no respect for authority whatsoever. I'd thanked him for the warning, though I wasn't particularly concerned. After dealing with homesick 19-year-old sailors fresh out of boot camp, I figured I could handle a few unruly teenagers. How difficult could it be? The classroom that had been assigned to me was on the 2nd floor, room 247, with windows that looked out over the school's parking lot and the small downtown area beyond. The previous teacher had left it in a state that could charitably be described as organized chaos. Desks were arranged haphazardly around the room, outdated textbooks were stacked in precarious towers, and the whiteboard was covered in what appeared to be months' worth of dried marker stains that hadn't been properly cleaned. I spent the first hour methodically rearranging the space to create clear sight lines and establish zones for different activities, principles I'd learned from organizing workspace efficiency on ship. Everything had a place, and everything needed to be in its place. The desk that would serve as my command center was positioned so I could see every corner of the room while maintaining easy access to the door. Old habits from security briefings. Die hard. As I was setting up my personal items on the desk, I caught myself arranging them with the same precision I'd used in my quarters on the ship. A small American flag in a wooden stand, a photo of Jake and me at his college graduation, a brass compass that had been a gift from my commanding officer, and a coffee mug with the USS Constellation's insignia. These weren't just decorations. They were reminders of who I was and where I'd come from. The morning sun was streaming through the windows when I heard the first sounds of students arriving. Lockers slamming, voices echoing through the corridors, the general chaos that comes, with hundreds of teenagers converging on a single building. I straightened my blazer, checked my appearance in the small mirror I'd hung behind my desk, and prepared to meet my first class. What I didn't know was that word had already spread through the school's social networks about the new teacher. In the age of smartphones and social media, news traveled faster than wildfire, and by the time the first bell rang, every student in Jefferson High knew that Mrs. Henderson's replacement had arrived. More importantly, they knew she was young, new to teaching, and potentially an easy target for the kind of harassment that had driven her predecessor to an early retirement. The first class of the day was 10th grade world history, a subject I'd actually enjoyed during my own high school years, and had continued to study during my time in the Navy. There's something about understanding the historical context of the regions where you're deployed that makes the mission more meaningful. I'd read extensively about the Pacific Theater during World War II, the Korean War, and the complex geopolitical relationships that shaped modern Asia. I was genuinely excited about the opportunity to share some of that knowledge with students who might never have considered how history connected to their daily lives. The students filed in with the casual indifference typical of teenagers everywhere. Most of them were focused on their phones, finishing last-minute homework or continuing conversations that had started in the hallway. I noticed the usual social dynamics at play, the way certain students gravitated towards specific areas of the classroom, based on invisible hierarchies that adults rarely understand, but that govern every aspect of teenage social interaction. There were the academic achievers who automatically chose seats in the front rows, notebooks already open and pens at the ready. Behind them sat the students who wanted to learn, but didn't want to appear too eager, striking a balance between engagement and social acceptance. Toward the back of the room, I noticed a group of students who seemed to move with a different kind of confidence, the kind that suggested they were used to being in control of their environment. The ringleader of this back row group was immediately obvious. He was a tall, athletic-looking young man with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of easy smile that probably got him out of trouble as often as it got him into it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His letterman jacket identified him as a member of the football team, and the way other students glanced at him suggested he held considerable social power within the school's ecosystem. This, I would later learn, was Connor Bradley, the quarterback of the Jefferson High Eagles and the son of one of the town's most prominent families. Flanking Connor were his two closest friends, both of whom also wore letterman jackets and carried themselves with the confident swagger of young men who'd never been told no. The first was Marcus Thompson, a stocky kid with dark hair and the kind of mean-spirited grin that suggested he enjoyed other people's discomfort. The second was Tyler Walsh, quieter than the other two, but with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the room, looking for weaknesses or opportunities. I began the class with a simple introduction, explaining that I was Miss Martinez, and that I'd be taking over for Mrs. Henderson for the remainder of the semester. I kept my military background to myself, not because I was ashamed of it, but because I'd learned that leading with authority often created resistance before you'd even had a chance to establish rapport. Better to let students get to know you as a person first, then reveal the full extent of your capabilities when necessary. "I know transitions can be difficult," I said, making eye contact with students throughout the room. Mrs. Henderson left. Detailed lesson plans, but I'm also excited to bring some of my own experiences and perspectives to our discussions of world history. I've had the opportunity to travel extensively, and I think you'll find that history becomes much more interesting when you can connect it to real places and real people. Most of the students seemed receptive, some even showing genuine interest when I mentioned my travels. But I noticed that Connor and his friends had exchanged glances during my introduction, the kind of look that suggested they were already sizing me up and finding me wanting. It was a look I'd seen before, usually from junior officers who thought they could intimidate someone they perceived as an outsider. The first few minutes of class proceeded smoothly. I distributed the textbooks and reviewed the syllabus, explaining my expectations for homework, participation, and classroom behavior. I kept my rules simple and clear, just as I'd learned to do when issuing orders to sailors who needed to understand exactly what was expected of them. Respect for others, active participation in discussions, and academic honesty were non-negotiable. Everything else was open for discussion. It was during the review of classroom expectations that I noticed the first signs of the challenge I'd be facing. While most students were taking notes, or at least pretending to pay attention, Connor had leaned back in his chair and was openly scrolling through his phone. When I paused in my explanation and looked directly at him, he didn't even bother to look up from his screen. "Mr. Bradley," I said, using the tone I'd perfected for getting the attention of distracted sailors, "I'd appreciate it if you could put your phone away and join us for the rest of the discussion." Connor looked up with an expression of exaggerated surprise, as if he couldn't believe I'd had the audacity to address him directly. "Oh, sorry, Ms. Martinez. I was just checking something important for my dad. You know, Bradley Construction. They're doing the new expansion on the school building." The implication was clear. His family had money and influence in the community, and I was just a temporary teacher who should be grateful for the job. It was a power play designed to establish the hierarchy in the classroom, and I recognized it immediately. I dealt with similar challenges from sailors who thought their connections or backgrounds made them immune to military discipline. "I understand that family business can be important," I replied calmly, "but during class time, I need your full attention. The phone can wait until after we're finished." Connor's smile never wavered, but I caught the flash of irritation in his eyes. He was used to adults backing down when he mentioned his family's prominence in the community. The fact that I hadn't immediately deferred to him had clearly caught him off guard. He made a show of putting his phone away, but I could tell this was far from over. The rest of the class period passed without major incident, though I noticed that Connor and his friends continued to test boundaries in small ways. Whispered conversations during my lectures, exaggerated sighs when I assigned reading, and the kind of eye-rolling that was just subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability if called out. These were classic intimidation tactics, designed to make a new teacher feel unwelcome and uncertain. As students filed out at the end of class, Connor made sure to brush past my desk just a little too closely, a gesture that could have been accidental but felt deliberately invasive. "Nice class, Ms. Martinez," he said with that same false smile. "I'm sure we're going to get along just fine." The words were polite enough, but the tone carried an undertone of threat that was unmistakable. This was his classroom, his school, his territory, and I was just a temporary visitor who should know my place. As he walked out with his friends, I heard one of them mutter something about fresh meat that sent a ripple of nervous laughter through the remaining students. I spent the brief break between classes processing what had just happened. In the Navy, I dealt with plenty of young sailors who thought they could challenge authority, but there were clear protocols for handling insubordination. Civilian teaching, I was beginning to realize, required a more nuanced approach. I couldn't simply order Connor to drop and give me 20 push-ups, no matter how much I might have wanted to. The second class of the day was Advanced Placement. World History, a smaller group of students who were generally more focused and academically motivated. The difference in atmosphere was immediately apparent. These students came in quietly, took their seats without drama, and had their materials ready before I'd even called the class to order. They listened attentively as I introduced myself and outlined my expectations, asked thoughtful questions about the curriculum, and showed genuine interest when I mentioned my travels. It was during this class that I met Jessica Chun, a quiet but brilliant student who would later become one of my most trusted allies. Jessica was the kind of student every teacher dreams of having, someone who was not only academically gifted, but also genuinely curious about the world around her. She asked insightful questions about how my military service had influenced my understanding of global politics, and I found myself sharing more about my background than I'd originally intended. I spent most of my time in the Pacific, I explained, which gave me a unique perspective on how World War II's legacy continues to shape relationships between nations today. When you're stationed in Japan or South Korea, you can't help but understand how historical events that seem distant and abstract in textbooks are still very much alive in people's memories. Jessica's eyes lit up with interest. Did you ever feel like your understanding of history changed because you were seeing it from a military perspective rather than just an academic one? It was exactly the kind of question that reminded me why I'd been excited about teaching in the first place. Absolutely, I replied. When you're responsible for the safety of people under your command, you start to understand that the decisions made by historical leaders weren't just abstract policy choices. They were life and death decisions that affected real people, just like the decisions we make today. The AP class ended on a high note, with several students staying after to ask additional questions about assignments and to express their enthusiasm for the semester ahead. It was a reminder that teaching could be incredibly rewarding when you had engaged, motivated students who were genuinely interested in learning. Unfortunately, my optimism was short-lived. The third class of the day was another section of 10th grade. World History, and Connor Bradley was back, this time with reinforcements. His two friends from the morning class had been joined by several other students who seemed to orbit around Connor's social circle. The atmosphere in the room was noticeably different from my first class, charged with a kind of anticipatory energy. That made me immediately alert. I began the class the same way I'd started the morning session, with a brief introduction and overview of expectations. But this time, Connor didn't even pretend to pay attention. He sprawled in his chair with his feet stretched out into the aisle, making it difficult for other students to move around the room. When I asked everyone to take out their notebooks, he made a show of searching through his backpack with exaggerated slowness, dumping the contents onto his desk with unnecessary noise. "Sorry, Ms. Martinez," he said with mock sincerity. I left my notebook in my locker. Mind if I go get it?" It was a transparent attempt to disrupt the class and establish his control over the situation. If I said yes, he'd take his time returning and probably bring back more distractions. If I said no, he'd argue that he couldn't participate without his materials, creating a no-win situation. "You can borrow paper from a classmate for today," I replied evenly. "Make sure you bring your notebook to every class from now on." Connor's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Of course, Ms. Martinez. I'll make sure to be more prepared next time." The sarcasm in his voice was unmistakable, and I noticed several of his friends snickering at his performance. This was clearly entertainment for them, a chance to see how far they could push the new teacher before she cracked. I'd seen similar dynamics in military training situations, where junior personnel would test the limits of authority figures to see who was truly in charge. As I began the day's lesson on the causes of World War I, the disruptions continued. Connor and his friends engaged in whispered conversations that were just loud enough to be distracting, but not quite loud enough for me to hear the content. They dropped pencils, rustled papers, and shifted in their chairs with the kind of restless energy that seemed designed to draw attention away from the lesson. About halfway through the class, Connor raised his hand with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Ms. Martinez, I have a question about the reading assignment." I was genuinely hopeful that he might be showing some interest in the material. "What's your question, Connor?" "Well, I was wondering if you think it's fair to assign so much reading when we don't even know if you're going to be here next week. I mean, Mrs. Henderson left pretty suddenly, and everyone's saying that this job is kind of cursed." The comment was designed to undermine my authority and plant doubt about my commitment to the position. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others looked at me with curiosity to see how I'd respond. It was a direct challenge that required a careful response. "I appreciate your concern about the workload," I said calmly. "But I'm here for the full semester, and I'm committed to helping all of you succeed. The reading assignments are designed to give you the background knowledge you'll need for our discussions and assessments. If you're having trouble managing the workload, I'm happy to discuss strategies that might help." Connor's expression suggested he hadn't expected such a measured response. He'd been looking for a reaction, either anger or defensiveness, that would have given him more ammunition for future confrontations. Instead, I'd acknowledged his concern while maintaining my authority and offering support. It was a technique I'd learned from dealing with sailors who were struggling with homesickness or adjustment issues, addressing the underlying concern while maintaining professional boundaries. The rest of the class continued with intermittent disruptions, but I noticed that Connor seemed less confident in his provocations. A few other students who had been following his lead began to focus more on the lesson, perhaps sensing that I wasn't going to be as easy to rattle as they'd hoped. As the class ended and students filed out, I heard Connor mutter to one of his friends, "Don't worry, we're just getting started. She'll be gone by the end of the month, just like the last one." The words were clearly meant for me to hear, a promise of escalating conflict to come. As I watched him swagger out of the classroom, I felt the familiar sensation I'd experienced before dangerous missions in the Navy, a heightened awareness that told me I was entering hostile territory where every decision could have significant consequences. The fourth and final class of the day was a study hall period that I was expected to supervise. Students from various grade levels were assigned to spend the period in my classroom, theoretically working on homework or studying for upcoming tests. In practice, it turned out to be an opportunity for Connor and his friends to regroup and plan their next moves. They entered the room with the casual confidence of generals surveying a battlefield they were confident of winning. Connor had acquired a few more followers since the previous class, including a girl named Brittany Morrison, who seemed to serve as the group's social media coordinator, constantly documenting their activities with her phone. There was also Derek Kim, a junior who had the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was eager to prove himself worthy of inclusion in Connor's inner circle. "Afternoon, Miss Martinez," Connor said as he strolled past my desk, his tone dripping with false courtesy. "Beautiful day, isn't it? Perfect weather for new beginnings." The comment seemed innocuous enough, but something about his tone put me on alert. I'd learned to trust my instincts about potential threats, and every instinct I had was telling me that Connor was planning something more significant than his previous classroom disruptions. The study hall period started quietly enough, with most students actually attempting to work on their assignments. But gradually, I began to notice unusual activity around Connor's group. They were passing notes, whispering intensely, and occasionally glancing in my direction with the kind of calculated looks that suggested they were discussing me specifically. About 20 minutes into the period, Connor approached my desk with what appeared to be a legitimate question about an upcoming history test. "Ms. Martinez, could you help me understand this section about the Treaty of Versailles? I'm having trouble with some of the terms." I was pleased to see what seemed like genuine academic engagement and began explaining the complex provisions of the treaty that had ended World War I. But as I spoke, I noticed that Connor wasn't really listening. His eyes kept drifting to the personal items on my desk, particularly the brass compass and the photo of Jake and me. "Is that your boyfriend?" he asked suddenly, pointing to the graduation photo. "That's my brother," I replied, wondering where this line of questioning was leading. "Oh, cool. What does he do?" "He's a student at the University of Iowa," I said, not elaborating on the medical situation that had brought me back to Cedar Falls. Connor nodded with apparent interest, but I could see the wheels turning in his mind. He was gathering information, filing away details that might be useful later. It was a reconnaissance mission disguised as casual conversation, and I recognized the technique from my own intelligence training. As Connor returned to his seat, I made a mental note to be more careful about what personal information I shared with students. In the military, we'd been trained to maintain operational security, to be mindful of what details we revealed about our personal lives and how that information could potentially be used against us or our missions. It was a lesson that apparently applied to civilian life as well. The final few minutes of the study hall period passed without incident, but I could feel the tension building like barometric pressure before a storm. Connor and his friends were too quiet, too focused on their whispered conversations. They were planning something, and I had the distinct feeling that I was about to find out what it was. As students packed up their belongings and prepared to leave, Connor made sure to pass by my desk one more time. "Have a great evening, Ms. Martinez," he said with that same false smile. "See you tomorrow." But as he walked away, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My brass compass, the one that had been prominently displayed on my desk all day, was missing. I quickly scanned the desktop, thinking it might have simply been moved or knocked over, but it was nowhere to be found. The compass wasn't valuable in monetary terms, but it held significant sentimental value as a gift from my commanding officer. More importantly, its disappearance sent a clear message. Connor and his friends had the ability to take things from my personal space without being caught, and they wanted me to know it. I spent the next hour after classes ended searching the classroom thoroughly, moving desks and checking every possible hiding place. The compass was simply gone. As I finally gave up the search and prepared to leave for the day, I realized that this was exactly what Connor had wanted. He'd successfully made me feel violated and vulnerable in my own classroom, demonstrating that he could reach me whenever he wanted. Driving home that evening through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, I found myself thinking about the strategic situation I'd walked into. Connor Bradley wasn't just a disruptive student. He was a skilled manipulator who understood how to use psychological warfare to achieve his goals. He'd driven out at least one teacher already, and he clearly had no intention of allowing me to establish authority in what he considered his territory. But what Connor didn't understand was that he was dealing with someone who'd been trained in environments far more hostile than a high school classroom. I'd navigated political tensions in foreign ports, managed complex operations under extreme pressure, and led teams through situations where failure wasn't an option. A teenage bully, no matter how clever or well-connected, was not going to intimidate me into abandoning my commitment to education. As I pulled into the driveway of the small house I'd rented near the medical center, I made a decision that would define everything that followed. I wasn't going to run away from this challenge the way Mrs. Henderson had. I was going to stand my ground, protect my students, and show Connor Bradley what real authority looked like. What I didn't know was that Connor was, at that very moment, sitting in his bedroom with his laptop open, researching everything he could find about Sarah Martinez online. He'd already discovered that I was a veteran, though he hadn't yet understood the full extent of my military background. He was planning his next move in what he saw as a game, treating my career and the education of his classmates as pawns in his personal power struggle. The compass sitting on his nightstand was just the beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of my resolve. and new opportunities for Connor to demonstrate why he'd been so successful at driving away previous teachers. But he was about to learn that some battles are won not by the loudest or most aggressive combatant, but by the one with the most disciplined strategy and the strongest commitment to their mission. I spent the evening reviewing the files Principal Davidson had given me about my students, paying particular attention to Connor's academic record and disciplinary history. What I found there confirmed my suspicions about the scope of the problem I was facing, but it also gave me valuable intelligence about how to approach the conflicts that were surely coming. The next morning would mark the beginning of a campaign that would test everything I'd learned about leadership, strategy, and the kind of quiet strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're capable of achieving. Connor. Bradley thought he was dealing with just another substitute teacher who would fold under pressure. He had no idea that he'd just declared war on someone who'd been trained to win battles in situations far more dangerous than anything Jefferson High School could throw at her. The second day at Jefferson High began with an email that immediately put me on high alert. Principal Davidson had sent a message at 5 in the morning, marked urgent, requesting that I meet with him before classes started. The tone was formal and concerned, which told me that whatever Connor had planned was already in motion. I arrived at school 30 minutes earlier than usual, parking in the same spot I'd used the day before. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the parking lot was nearly empty except for a few faculty cars and the custodial staff vehicles. As I walked toward the main entrance, I noticed something that made me pause. My car would be visible from several classroom windows, including my own, which meant that anyone watching would know exactly when I arrived and left each day. In military terms, my patterns were being observed and cataloged. Principal Davidson's office was located on the first floor, behind the main administrative area where the secretaries managed the daily chaos of student schedules, parent phone calls, and the endless paperwork that seemed to define modern education. His door was already open when I knocked, and he gestured for me to take a seat across from his desk with an expression that conveyed both sympathy and frustration. "Ms. Martinez, I'm afraid we need to discuss some concerns that have been brought to my attention," he began, his voice carrying the weary tone of someone who'd had similar conversations many times before. "I received several phone calls last night from parents expressing worry about the direction of your classes." I felt my jaw tighten slightly, recognizing the opening moves of a coordinated campaign. What specific concerns were raised? Davidson pulled out a manila folder and opened it to reveal several printed pages. The parents reported that their children came home upset about what they described as an overly militaristic approach to classroom management. There were also concerns about inappropriate personal sharing regarding your military service and questions about whether you're qualified to teach civilian students. Every word was carefully chosen to sound reasonable while being completely false. I'd shared minimal information about my background, and my classroom management had been standard and professional. But I could see how Connor and his parents had crafted these complaints to sound legitimate while being impossible to definitively disprove. "Principal Davidson, I can assure you that my classroom management follows standard educational practices," I replied calmly. "As for sharing personal information, I mentioned my travel experiences only in the context of providing real-world connections to historical events. Nothing I've done has been inappropriate or unprofessional." Davidson nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "I believe you, Ms. Martinez, but you have to understand the position this puts me in. The Bradley family is particularly influential in this community, and when they raise concerns, the school board pays attention. I need you to be extra careful about maintaining strict professional boundaries and ensuring that your military background doesn't overshadow your role as an educator." The message was clear without being explicitly stated. I was being warned that Connor's family had significant political power in the community, and that any further complaints could jeopardize my position. It was a masterful political maneuver, using the administrative system to apply pressure, while maintaining plausible deniability about the true motives behind the complaints. "I understand completely," I said, though what I really understood was that I was dealing with opponents who knew how to manipulate systems far beyond the school environment. "I'll make sure to maintain the highest professional standards." As I left Davidson's office and walked toward my classroom, I found myself analyzing the tactical situation with the same methodical approach I'd used when assessing potential threats during naval operations. Connor and his allies weren't just school bullies. They were part of a larger power structure that extended into the community's political and economic networks. They'd successfully weaponized the parent complaint process to put me on the defensive, before I'd even had a chance to establish my authority. But they'd also made a crucial mistake by moving too quickly. The complaints were clearly coordinated and based on distorted versions of actual events, which meant they could be documented and potentially disproven. More importantly, their eagerness to escalate suggested that they viewed me as a more serious threat than they'd initially realized. People don't deploy heavy artillery against targets they consider harmless. The hallway leading to my classroom was busier than it had been the previous morning, with students gathered in small groups that seemed to be engaged in more intense conversations than typical teenage social interaction. As I passed, I caught fragments of whispered discussions that included phrases like "new teacher," "military crazy," and "won't last long." The rumor mill was clearly working overtime, spreading whatever version of events Connor wanted the school to believe. My classroom looked exactly as I'd left it the day before, with one notable exception. A piece of paper had been slipped under my door, folded once, and placed precisely in the center of the entryway. I couldn't miss it. The positioning was deliberate, designed to ensure that I would see it immediately upon entering and understand that my space could be accessed even when I wasn't present. I picked up the paper with the same careful attention I'd use when handling potentially dangerous materials. It was a photocopy of a newspaper article from the Cedar Falls Gazette, dated 3 weeks earlier, with a headline that read, "Local construction company wins major school contract." The article featured a large photo of Connor's father, Robert Bradley, shaking hands with several school board members at what appeared to be a groundbreaking ceremony. The message was unmistakable. The Bradley family didn't just have influence in the community. They had direct financial relationships with the school system that employed me. By highlighting their construction contract, Connor was demonstrating that his family's economic interests were directly tied to the school's operations, which gave them leverage that extended far beyond typical parental concerns. But the article also revealed something that Connor probably hadn't intended to share. The construction project was described as a major expansion that would create jobs and bring significant revenue to the community. That kind of high-profile project would come with intense scrutiny and accountability requirements. Any hint of scandal or negative publicity could potentially threaten the contract, which meant the Bradley family had just as much to lose as they had to gain from their position of influence. I filed this information away as I prepared for the day's classes, recognizing that Connor had just given me valuable intelligence about his family's vulnerabilities. In naval operations, we'd learned that the most powerful opponents often had the most to protect, which could be used strategically if the situation required escalation. The first class of the day proceeded smoothly, with my morning students showing the same level of engagement and respect they'd demonstrated previously. But I noticed that several of them seemed more cautious in their interactions with me, as if they'd been warned to be careful about what they said or did. The informal network of teenage communication had clearly been activated to spread whatever narrative Connor wanted to establish about my teaching methods and professional competence. It was during the break between first and second period that I encountered my next challenge. I was making copies of a worksheet in the faculty workroom when I found myself face to face with Mrs. Patricia Hoffman, a veteran English teacher who'd been at Jefferson High for over 20 years. She was the kind of educator who'd earned respect through decades of dedicated service, and her opinion carried significant weight among both faculty and parents. "Ms. Martinez," she said with a polite but distant smile, "I wanted to introduce myself and welcome you to Jefferson High. I hope you're finding the transition to civilian teaching manageable." The emphasis on civilian was subtle but unmistakable, suggesting that she'd already heard whatever version of my background was circulating through the school's informal communication networks. Her tone was professional but carried an undertone of concern that suggested she'd been influenced by the same rumors that were affecting my students. "Thank you, Mrs. Hoffman. I'm enjoying the opportunity to work with such engaged students," I replied, choosing my words carefully to avoid saying anything that could be misinterpreted or taken out of context. "I'm sure you are," she said, her smile never wavering. Teaching high school students requires a very different approach than military leadership. These are children, not soldiers, and they need patience and understanding rather than rigid discipline. The comment was designed to sound like helpful advice while actually reinforcing the narrative that I was somehow inappropriate for the civilian classroom environment. It was a sophisticated form of professional undermining that used the language of concern to deliver criticism. "I completely agree," I said, maintaining my composure despite the obvious manipulation. "Every student is an individual who deserves respect and personalized attention. That's one of the things I find most rewarding about education." Mrs. Hoffman looked slightly surprised by my response, perhaps expecting me to defend my military background or become defensive about the implied criticism. Instead, I'd agreed with her stated concern while subtly redirecting the conversation toward positive aspects of teaching. It was a technique I'd learned from diplomatic briefings, where the goal was to find common ground while avoiding confrontational topics. "Well, I'm sure you'll find your rhythm," she said, her tone slightly less certain than it had been at the beginning of our conversation. "If you need any advice about managing classroom dynamics, please don't hesitate to ask. Some of our students can be quite challenging for new teachers." The offer was genuine enough, but it also contained a warning about the difficulties I was likely to face. Mrs. Hoffman was clearly well-intentioned, but she'd been influenced by whatever information was circulating about my teaching methods and professional background. Connor's campaign was working exactly as he'd intended, creating doubt and concern among people who might otherwise have been supportive. The second period advanced placement class provided a welcome respite from the psychological warfare being waged in the hallways. Jessica Chun and her classmates were focused on learning, asking thoughtful questions about the day's topic and engaging in genuine academic discussion. It was a reminder of why I'd been drawn to teaching in the first place and a source of motivation to continue fighting for the right to do my job effectively. But even in this positive environment, I noticed subtle changes from the previous day. A few students seemed more reserved in their participation, and I caught several glances between classmates that suggested they'd been discussing something related to my presence at the school. The rumor network had reached even the most academically focused students, though they were too polite and mature to let it significantly impact their classroom behavior. It was Jessica who provided the most valuable intelligence about what was happening behind the scenes. As other students filed out at the end of class, she lingered near my desk with the kind of calculated casualness that suggested she had something important to communicate. "Ms. Martinez, I wanted to let you know that there are some rumors going around about you," she said quietly, glancing toward the door to make sure we weren't being overheard. "Connor Bradley has been telling people that you're some kind of military hard case who's going to turn the school into a boot camp." I appreciated her directness and her willingness to share information that could help me understand the scope of the campaign against me. "Thank you for letting me know, Jessica." What specific things is he saying? He's claiming that you told students about killing people in combat and that you threaten to use physical force on anyone who misbehaves in class. She replied, her voice filled with obvious skepticism about these claims. Most people with any sense know he's lying, but some of the younger students are actually scared. The accusations were serious enough to potentially end my career if they gained credibility, but they were also so extreme that they revealed the desperation behind Connor's strategy. He was throwing everything he could think of at me, hoping that something would stick and create enough controversy to force my resignation. I appreciate you sharing this information with me, I said carefully. You should know that none of those things are true, and if anyone has concerns about my teaching methods, they should feel free to speak with Principal Davidson or come to me directly. Jessica nodded, her expression serious. I know they're not true, Ms. Martinez. You've been nothing but professional and respectful. But Connor has a lot of influence with certain groups of students, and he's really good at making people believe what he wants them to believe. Her assessment confirmed what I'd already observed about Connor's manipulative abilities. He wasn't just a typical bully who relied on physical intimidation. He was a skilled operator who understood how to use information warfare to achieve his objectives. The fact that he was spreading false accusations about my military service showed that he'd done at least some research into my background, though clearly not enough to understand what he was really dealing with. The third period class was where Connor made his next major move. He arrived with his usual entourage, but this time they were accompanied by several students I hadn't seen before, including some who appeared to be older and more physically imposing than typical sophomores. The classroom felt crowded and tense in a way that hadn't been the case during previous sessions. Connor took his usual seat in the back row, but instead of his typical disruptive behavior, he sat quietly with a small digital recording device prominently displayed on his desk. The message was clear. He was documenting everything I said and did, presumably to provide evidence for whatever accusations he was planning to make next. Good morning, everyone, I began, maintaining my professional demeanor despite the obvious provocation. Today we're going to continue our discussion of the factors that led to World War I, with particular focus on the alliance system that made a regional conflict into a global war. I noticed that Connor was indeed recording, holding his phone in a way that would capture both audio and video of my presentation. Several of his friends were also recording, creating a coordinated documentation effort that felt more like a surveillance operation than typical student behavior. As I began explaining the complex web of treaties and obligations that had bound European nations together in the early 20th century, Connor raised his hand with exaggerated enthusiasm. Ms. Martinez, I have a question about military strategy, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room and obviously intended for his recording devices. In your experience commanding troops in combat situations, how do you decide when violence is the appropriate response to a conflict? The question was designed to elicit a response that could be edited and used out of context to support his false narrative about my teaching methods. If I answered directly, he could claim I was discussing military violence in an inappropriate educational setting. If I refused to answer, he could argue that I was being secretive about my background. That's an interesting question about historical military decision-making, I replied carefully, but it's not directly relevant to our current discussion. Of the diplomatic failures that led to World War I, if you're interested in studying military history in more detail, I'd be happy to recommend some excellent academic resources after class. Connor's expression showed momentary frustration at my refusal to walk into his trap, but he quickly recovered with his characteristic false smile. Of course, Ms. Martinez, I just thought your personal experience might give us some unique insights into how military leaders think. Historical analysis is based on documented evidence and scholarly research, I responded, not personal anecdotes. Now, Let's return to our discussion of how the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand triggered the alliance system that escalated a regional crisis into a world war. The rest of the class period continued with Connor and his friends making increasingly obvious attempts to provoke me into saying something that could be recorded and used against me. They asked loaded questions about military discipline, made comments about the appropriateness of veterans in educational settings, and created a constant undercurrent of tension that was clearly designed to make me lose my composure. But their strategy revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of military training and professional discipline. They expected me to react emotionally to their provocations, not realizing that I'd been trained to maintain operational effectiveness under far more stressful conditions than anything they could create in a high school classroom. As the class ended and students filed out, Connor made sure to pass close to my desk with his recording device still active. "Thanks for the great lesson, Ms. Martinez," he said loudly enough for his microphone to capture clearly. "I'm really learning a lot about how military thinking applies to civilian situations." The comment was carefully crafted to sound innocent while actually creating the impression that I was inappropriately mixing military and educational approaches. It was exactly the kind of selective documentation that could be used to support false accusations while maintaining plausible deniability about the true intent behind his actions. After Connor and his friends left, I noticed that several students who weren't part of his group lingered near my desk with expressions of concern and embarrassment. These were students who wanted to learn and who recognized that their classroom environment was being poisoned by Connor's campaign, but who felt powerless to intervene without potentially becoming targets themselves. "Ms. Martinez," said a quiet girl named Rachel who'd been trying to take notes despite the constant disruptions, "I'm sorry about how some people are acting. Most of us really appreciate having you as our teacher." Her comment was echoed by several other students who expressed similar sentiments about wanting to learn and being frustrated by the ongoing disruptions. It was encouraging to know that Connor's influence wasn't universal, but it also highlighted the fact that his behavior was affecting the educational experience of students who deserved better. The study hall period that concluded my teaching day brought the most serious escalation yet. Connor arrived with his recording equipment and his expanded group of supporters, but this time he'd also brought what appeared to be official documentation. As students settled into their seats, he approached my desk with a folder that he placed conspicuously in front of me. "Ms. Martinez, my father asked me to give you this," he said in a voice that carried throughout the room. "It's some information about proper procedures for veteran teachers in civilian educational environments." I opened the folder to find what appeared to be excerpts from state education guidelines, highlighted and annotated to emphasize sections related to the supervision and evaluation of teachers with military backgrounds. The documents were legitimate, but they'd been selectively edited to create the impression that veteran educators required special oversight and were subject to additional restrictions not applied to other teachers. The psychological impact was immediate and powerful. By presenting these documents in front of other students, Connor was publicly suggesting that I was under investigation or special scrutiny from educational authorities. It was a masterful piece of information warfare that used official-looking documentation to create an aura of legitimacy around his campaign against me. But as I read through the materials more carefully, I realized that Connor had made a tactical error. The guidelines he'd highlighted actually supported the value of military experience in educational settings, emphasizing the leadership skills and disciplinary training that veterans brought to classroom management. By trying to use these documents against me, he'd actually provided evidence of why my background was an asset rather than a liability. "Thank you for sharing this information," I said calmly, closing the folder and setting it aside. "These guidelines confirm that veteran educators bring valuable experience to civilian teaching environments. I appreciate your father's interest in ensuring that all teachers meet the highest professional standards." Connor's confident expression faltered as he realized that his weapon had been turned against him. The documents he'd intended to use for intimidation actually supported my qualifications and professional standing. Several students who'd been watching the exchange with interest began to murmur among themselves, clearly recognizing that something significant had just happened. "I'm sure my father will be interested to hear about your interpretation of those guidelines," Connor said, his voice carrying a slightly sharper edge than before. "He takes educational quality very seriously." "As do I replied evenly. "I'm committed to providing the best possible education for all my students, regardless of any external pressures or distractions." The exchange was brief, but it marked a turning point in our ongoing conflict. Connor had expected me to be intimidated by his family's apparent influence and official-looking documentation. Instead, I demonstrated that I could not only withstand his psychological attacks, but actually use his own weapons against him. As the study hall period continued, I noticed significant changes in the dynamics within the classroom. Students who'd been following Connor's lead began to distance themselves slightly, perhaps recognizing that they'd backed the wrong side in this particular conflict. Others who'd been staying neutral started to show more obvious support for my authority, participating more actively in classroom management and following instructions without the subtle resistance they'd shown previously. Connor himself seemed to realize that his tactics weren't working as effectively as he'd hoped. His recording became less obvious, and his provocative comments became fewer and more carefully worded. He was beginning to understand that he was dealing with someone who couldn't be easily manipulated or intimidated into abandoning her position. The day ended with what felt like a strategic stalemate. Connor had deployed significant resources in his campaign against me, including family influence, coordinated rumors, false accusations, and psychological intimidation. But none of these tactics had achieved their intended goal of forcing my resignation or creating enough controversy to justify my removal. More importantly, his escalating attacks had revealed the extent of his capabilities and resources, giving me valuable intelligence about what I was facing and how to counter future moves. In military terms, he'd shown me his full strength while failing to achieve any decisive victories, which put him in a strategically disadvantageous position going forward. As I drove home that evening, I found myself thinking about the broader implications of what was happening at Jefferson High. Connor's campaign wasn't just about removing one teacher. It was about maintaining a power structure that allowed certain students to terrorize others without consequences. Mrs. Henderson had probably been a decent educator who'd been driven away by similar tactics, and there were likely other teachers and students who'd suffered under this system of organized intimidation. The missing compass on my nightstand reminded me that this conflict was far from over. Connor had shown that he could reach into my personal space and take things that mattered to me, demonstrating a level of audacity that suggested he felt completely immune to consequences. But he'd also given me a clear indication of how far he was willing to go, which meant I could plan accordingly for whatever escalation was coming next. That evening, I spent time researching Connor's family background, using the same investigative techniques I'd learned for gathering intelligence on potential security threats. What I discovered confirmed my suspicions about the scope of the challenge I was facing, but it also revealed potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited if the situation continued to escalate. The Bradley family had indeed built significant wealth and influence through their construction business, winning major contracts throughout the region and maintaining close relationships with local political figures. But their success had also created enemies and competitors who might be willing to share information about questionable business practices or ethical violations. More interesting was what I learned about Connor's personal history. His academic record showed a pattern of behavioral problems that had been consistently overlooked or minimized, suggesting that his current campaign against me was part of a larger pattern of using his family's influence to avoid accountability for his actions. There were also indications that Connor's behavior had escalated over time, with more serious incidents being buried or resolved through private negotiations rather than official disciplinary procedures. This suggested that the school administration was either unable or unwilling to hold him accountable, which meant that any resolution to our conflict would likely have to come through other channels. As I prepared for bed that night, I realized that I was facing a choice that would define not only my own future, but potentially the educational environment for every student at Jefferson High. I could continue to endure Connor's attacks while hoping that he would eventually lose interest, or I could take a more proactive approach to ending his campaign of intimidation. My military training had taught me that the best defense is often a strong offense, but it had also emphasized the importance of proportional response and minimizing collateral damage. Whatever strategy I chose would need to be carefully calibrated to achieve my objectives without creating additional problems or putting innocent students at risk. The brass compass sitting on Connor's nightstand was more than just a stolen trophy. It was a declaration of war. He'd made it clear that he considered this a personal conflict that would continue until one of us was forced to surrender. What he didn't understand was that he'd just challenged someone who'd been trained never to surrender, never to abandon her mission, and never to allow bullies to determine the fate of those under her protection. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to demonstrate that some fights are worth having, regardless of the odds or the potential consequences. Connor Bradley was about to learn that real strength doesn't come from family connections or political influence, but from the unshakable conviction that protecting others is more important than protecting yourself. The war for Jefferson High School was just beginning, and I intended to win it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.